As of late, it feels like that Cyberpunk 2077 has had kind of a series of rather confusing or bizarre events happening around the game, so in this video I want to go over what exactly those were. One of the first ones is this story around the biggest update ever. Just recently, ads started popping up describing the biggest update yet for Cyberpunk. The ads popped up on seemingly Facebook as well as Instagram, and the phrasing on this left a lot of people kind of confused. Is it talking about an upcoming update, like this is a teaser for some big update, or is it referring to a past one? A lot of people landed on the fact that it was referring to something new, considering the most recent update wasn't actually all that big. And this seemed to be backed up even further as WitcherCon was approaching, as well as there were some changes on SteamDB, indicating that a larger update was in the works, and even Prickly Assassin, who leaked some of the DLCs in the past, mentioned a nearly 40 gigabyte update on the Epic Game Store. So tons of people got hyped that something big was coming for Cyberpunk 2077, and it seems like it was destined to be announced at WitcherCon. And there was even several articles and videos on it, except all of that came crashing down when CDPR responded to a Tyler McVicker tweet saying this was a short marketing campaign which we ran as a reminder of patch 1.2 and the fact that Cyberpunk 2077 is available on digital storefronts for PC, Xbox, and PlayStation players. Information on any future updates will be published in due time via our official channels. And basically, to make a long story short, it seems like this was actually an old ad, an ad used all the way back in March when patch 1.2, the biggest update the game ever got, actually came out. And more or less with the return to the PlayStation Store over the past week or so, CDPR just decided, hey, why don't we just use that old ad again? Because why not? Not like that'll cause any confusion. And to me, this entire thing is incredibly bizarre. Put it into context, patch 1.2, which again was the biggest update ever, came out in March. There have been 3 updates since then. Not to mention the ad itself doesn't actually mention patch 1.2 or which updates it's referring to, which, okay, that kind of makes sense. Most casual users don't really know the patch numbers. But even further, it never even mentions the PlayStation Store. So they just kind of decided, hey, the game's back on PlayStation, why don't we tell people about this update we released 3 months ago, or really 3.5 months ago. Overall, it just feels incredibly misleading, and especially the timing with this starting to go viral the week of WitcherCon, where a ton of people were kind of speculating we would find out something around Cyberpunk's future in general. And just in general, the current situation with Cyberpunk 2077 is strange. The last update took around 7 weeks to release, which is a pretty long time in between updates for a game that still very much so needs them. The last time an update took that long was with 8 weeks and the patch 1.2 update that was massive, literally the biggest update ever, like the ad says. Despite that, the most recent patch with patch 1.23 didn't really have that much. It did have some nice bug fixing changes, there were some slight FPS improvements on consoles, but it was a relatively small update overall and not a monster like patch 1.2. And at the end of this week, it'll be a month since the last update to the game, and with how little content that one had and how we haven't heard much about the future, a lot of people are kind of curious what's going on. Why are some of these updates so small, especially when there's a lot of lingering bugs, issues, or just features that need to be added or overhauled? Especially when you take into context some of those recent quotes where apparently the president thinks that the game is in a satisfactory state right now. Further, CDPR remains pretty adamant that these free DLCs and next-gen update for Cyberpunk are coming in 2021 at some point, but now we are over halfway done with the year. We're halfway through July. The game just turned 7 months old, and we literally know nothing about any of this. What the free DLCs will be, what the next-gen update will entail, or even when it's coming out. It seemed like it was really likely we heard something at E3 that came and went. It seemed really likely we heard something at WitcherCon that came and went with really no mention of Cyberpunk, but even there, we actually got some updates around the next-gen version of The Witcher 3, so work is progressing on that, and we know when that's coming out now. And I don't think many people would have expected the game to still be in the state it is, as well as us knowing nothing about what's coming next 7 months after release. Although, what may shed some light on this, but is also kind of a perplexing thing going on with this game, is this kind of beta or really on-disc early build that has been found and is now being studied. So more or less, with Cyberpunk 2077, we heard how in October it went gold. What that means is the game is kind of put onto the disc. This is not the complete version of the game, and as you could argue, even the game that did come out on December 10th was not the complete version of the game, but this on-disc version is a notable point, a notable milestone, even though many people assume that the day one patch will come after and add in or fix more things. And more or less, what was actually discovered was if if you delete your local content of Cyberpunk on a console, as well as have one of these discs and disconnect your console from the internet, you can play the version of the game that is on that disc. And there are some very interesting differences. And to be clear, this is a version of the game several months before the release version, without the day one patch, without several of the other internal patches that went on. Tyler McVicker just made a really good video documenting some of this and seems to have more information on the way, and there's even several other channels covering some of the things found in this build. You can see things like street vendors that actually sell things in the live version of the game. These just stand there, you can't actually buy anything. You can actually inspect items, which is kind of a huge feature. A lot of people have been asking this from day one, and it's in this version. The world map is actually fully interactable and 3D. Verticality actually works with waypoints and zooming in and around. In addition, just a ton of interesting interactions, hidden areas of the map that you could find in this build, but also some in the live build. There's entire channels dedicated to documenting some of the things here. I'll have a few links down below, like Destructing the Games, Ventra, as well as Pablo397. So on one hand, it's rather odd or confusing that these things were cut. I guess some of the justifications are likely around performance, like maybe CDPR literally cut street vendors because they were hurting performance too much. But I also wouldn't be shocked if one of the free DLCs, and to be clear, the free DLCs for The Witcher were typically relatively small. Don't expect full-on expansions. Those are coming later and will be paid. But one of those free DLCs may add in some of these features like street vendors or inspecting. Okay, hopefully inspecting items isn't a DLC and it's an update, but still, it's just all very weird. Although to end off on a more positive note, it seems like a turnaround may be happening, even though things have been very quiet with the game. And in CDPR's fairness, they have mentioned how they are going to be more quiet about future plans for this game, because in the past, saying too much has gotten them in trouble. But we just heard from PlayStation how Cyberpunk 2077 was the top downloaded game in the US, Canada, and Europe for the PS4 for the month of June, which is actually really impressive. The game only returned to the PlayStation Store on June 21st, so it only really had around 10 days to work with. Now granted, there wasn't a ton of competition. This also doesn't include the PS5 games. Technically, Cyberpunk doesn't have an official PS5 version right now. You could just emulate it on the PS5. Although at the same time, some people have been taking this out of context or kind of blowing this up too much, with some articles saying it's one of the best-selling games of June or the best-selling game of June. This is technically looking at download, so it could just mean people saw the game return to PlayStation and re-downloaded it, decided to give it another go. Likely a huge portion of this is also new sales, people either rebuying it, maybe they refunded it in the past, or buying it for the first time. But it does genuinely seem like this return to the PlayStation Store has actually given the game a pretty nice boost, as even if you look at the Steam charts for this game, for the first month now, it is actually not lost but gained players at about 9% player gain. Not huge, and it has been literally bleeding players every month since release, but that's a healthy gain for a game that just crossed 7 months old and got a relatively lackluster update. Patch 1.23 was not something to bring a ton of people back, especially on PC. So it really seems like this is motivated predominantly by the return to the PlayStation Store, that kind of being a signal to the industry overall and all platforms like, hey, maybe try this game again. Regardless, I don't actually know what the future holds for Cyberpunk. I thought at this point we definitely would have at least known some release dates for DLC, but right now we know nothing. It doesn't really seem like there's a next obvious event or milestone that will be hit to actually mark the announcement for this DLC, so it'll likely just be tweeted out one day. We also don't know much about this next update. Hopefully it's a larger one, but I really thought the last one was going to be a larger one with that 7 weeks of dev time, give or take. But either way, I'll be keeping you guys up to date with all of this. I have another video planned on the mods of Cyberpunk, as there's been a lot happening on that front also. Until then though, I thank you all again for watching, and that's kind of an update on the rather perplexing status of Cyberpunk 2077 right now.